So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Jeremy Clines. Jeremy is a chaplain at the University of Sheffield. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I come as a collaborative activist. I join feminist theologians who see our collective task of spiritual development as a communal quilting exercise in an interconnected web of solidarity, where together we can esteem our heritage, our shared identity, and our imagined future together. I arrive here because of quilting with close colleagues in Sheffield. Ali Dorey and Sue Hammersley is here. Together, we began to ask questions about improving the quality of conversation in the Church of England in relation to gender rights and equality. And when I think of gender rights, I think of multiple gender rights and trans rights too myself. We work together using principles of non-violent communication, and it is with Ali and Sue, particularly, that I cope with and am surviving moral injury. This talk asks, what if we apply an external lens to the matter of the conduct of the C of E? What does such a reading of the C of E's conduct do to us? And what can we choose about our approach to serving in the C of E? Today, I offer a perspective, a proposition, and encouragements to look after ourselves in systemically oppressive organisations. I work in two organisations, the C of E and the higher education sector. Choosing an approach can be helped by choosing a perspective. I am choosing to take several steps back from the echo chambers within the C of E. I'm seeking to constantly review the church through a trauma-informed human rights lens. I wonder how many of us use such a lens. And I wonder if we can all do so more readily on a day conference than in the day-to-day. Let's get a sense of what the C of E looks like from the outside. I've learnt to look at the C of E the way I do over many years. Here's 4 of the steps I've taken to help that. Since '99, I've been a chaplain, finding it a less traumatizing approach to being a religious professional. And my university setting has helped, since my role functions in a sphere where equalities, diversity, and inclusion are more visible, though by no means unproblematic. That shifted viewpoint for me. And then, second, in 2007, I asked Dan Cohn-Sherbock, a Jewish theologian and rabbi, about my hopes for interreligious dialogue based on scriptural reasoning. I wanted to know if he thought such dialogue would have a useful purpose for building peace, both here and even in the Middle East. Dan's response, which I accept, is that trading texts to justify peace is inherently weak, since there are plenty of other texts, or even the same texts, that could be used to justify violence. He suggested the better text for dialogue and improved peace is human rights principles. 15 years later, I attended a United Nations-sponsored Faith for Rights pilot training. This new training is designed for religion and belief community leaders. At such UN-sponsored courses, people undertake what Dan Cohn-Sherbock had recommended, dialogue about how we operate at the crossroads of religion and human rights. And wow, how different religious preferences and priorities and discriminations look once you intersect such actions with human rights. Much to learn, much food for thought. fourth step, I last year shared with my spiritual guide this developing perspective on the C of E. His response is late 20th century Christians still regarded theology as a superior framework for judging the validity of the C of E's purposes for the world. But my guide could see it's different now in a fragmenting church, notorious for its inequalities. Theologically based claims and counterclaims are so divisive that there isn't the ability to achieve consensus via a common theology. I and my guide saw together that human rights has a usefully different validity, authority, and quality to anything that the church in general, or the C of E in particular, can produce alone. These and other steps have resolved me in developing my perspective, commentary, and response to want to encourage. When we consider equality legislation, it can be astonishing to view the C of E through a human rights lens, because it becomes apparent that there are inherent prejudices that play out in the day-to-day life of the organisation, which are legitimised by state-authorised exemptions. The C of E has legal exemptions from human rights being used in legal judgments against it. These exemptions are used to protect folks' beliefs, and I continue to offer a level of sympathy and understanding for that. I also want to emphasise that this leads to an unsatisfactory moral settlement, causing confused, complicated reactions with folks feeling out of balance. The difficulty is one person's beliefs, which are protected, may be the very things that can lead to marginalisation and oppression of other people in the church. To protect one person's beliefs in a way that permits discriminatory views about another person's sex, gender, and many other things, is part of the current settlement, which a human rights perspective helps to unpick. The PR gloss for mutual flourishing, that it can achieve balance and consensus, has lost its shine. My perspective is that such an approach can never meet diverse needs fairly, especially because it builds in a vow, yes, a vow, not a conversation, for too many of us serving, and asks us to perpetuate unfairness to others and ourselves. I hope today is part of beginning to have a better conversation in the C of E about C of E impinging on different people's freedoms to different levels and in unequal ways. Such dialogue is complex and yet possible in a way that gives fuller respect to people's human rights. An enlivening conversation asks what the most pressing needs are and how those needs can be met, beginning with the people most in need of having freedom from discrimination. It's commonly understood that the more protected characteristics a person has, that this will multiply the person's chances of suffering oppression. This tragically is simply how discrimination works against folks with intersectional identities. So when we begin, think about women and the church today. Their right to freedom their right to freedom of religion or belief is one thing. I'm going to be doing some counting. And their sex, including their gender rights, are a second thing. And those two topics intersect. I need to stick my hands up and not lose my notes. There we go. First thing, religion or belief. Second thing, sex, their sex and gender. Then that intersects. And that's a third thing, that intersection. 3 things, because the intersection creates a compounding of discrimination. That's 3 needs. And we might need to have to compare that to another person's 1 need of their religion or belief protecting them, being protected. If a woman is also experiencing racial inequality, an approximate but fair accounting totals not just religion or belief and their sex and their race or ethnic identity, those 3 characteristics, but their intersectional identities too, and that's each of those intersections. That's a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th need. And then the whole bundle of intersections, because there's 3 intersections between 1 and 2, between 2 and 3, and between 1 and 3. So there's 3 individual intersections. The bundle of intersections is a 7th need. So this is the perspective I want to share with you today. And now to move on to the proposition that by us being in a C of E that is systematically oppressive, we and or others may knowingly or unknowingly be experiencing moral injury. When we gain a human rights perspective of what the C of E looks like, we notice the way that we're complicit with injustice on the inside. The proposition I offer is that we may want to describe the needs that arise and the feelings we have from being part of a morally injurious process for ourselves and others, an injury both spiritual and psychological. And that's where this proposition will lead to considering how we first notice and more crucially survive the injury. And surviving means facing the contradiction of being active servants, preaching liberty and freedom, and yet in a web of connections that includes oppression and injury. My proposition is that moral injury may explain what it is like working within an oppressive organisation, since there are 3 factors that are used to determine moral injury. There has been a betrayal of what is morally right by someone who holds legitimate authority, and it is a high-stakes situation. In my view, the Church's conduct in the C of E consistently and regularly meets the first 2. As to the matter of how high the stakes are, the concept of moral injury developed in interpreting distress of military personnel and subsequently for health and social care workers, especially from the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I reckon it's a high-stakes situation in the C of E too, in this now, because of the following. A, the C of E still contains unhealthy cultures of deference that result in disempowerment, perpetuating a collective lack of resistance to systemic injustice. B, many of us in ministry find the personal and the performative are commingled. This is because when we are in active service, as the visible sign of the C of E, it is our authentic selves, not just our performative selves, we bring, expressing so much of ourselves through our service. And so the more the systemic injustice impinges upon us. And I think that becoming spiritually exposed and vulnerable is a significant risk in this type of active service. And by meeting others' needs, we stand in harm's way. I reckon the stakes are high because our spiritual and moral selves cannot be isolated from the morally suspect and spiritually injurious actions of the C of E. The concept of moral injury is based on seeing some people directly impacted and others not in the same situation. My sense is even if only some experience the injury, collectively, we are all part of the same process of unresolved, unmet needs and the arising negative feelings. However slightly or profoundly it is accentuated in in ourselves. I want to move from proposition to encouragement, and encouragement to survive well, where our C of E might be morally injurious. I want to encourage us to encourage one another so as to aid our surviving, our healing, our recovery. Beware, though, all of us, of two other routes which do not concentrate on healing and recovery. I want to mention those first before we think about surviving together through healing and recovery. The first route to beware of is a shortcut, the human capacity to compartmentalize. We may be able to set the systemic injustice we are witness to or suffer ourselves in a separate place that is not immediately distracting from the more simple tasks there are to do that we have to look after in our service in the church. I want to encourage us in our spiritual accompaniment of one another to resist the shortcut, which requires us to live in contradiction to our own moral, spiritual, and human rights values. A second route to beware of allows us to acknowledge the injury, but responds by attempting to endure or tolerate the pain. This route is a path of sacrifice. And of course, there's plenty of Christian theologies that promote the sacrificing of self. We may think it's worthy to use our energy in an attempt to atone for the wrongs perpetrated by others. Let's notice self-sacrificing efforts for what they are, the appeal they might have, and their cost. I believe the second route of sacrifice risks promoting passive victimhood and can perpetuate persistent rescuing. For too long, in many liberation movements, folks keep going and suffering by keeping their eyes on the prize. The risks are immense when efforts become solo. And now we see rates of burnout are sky high and deep injury becomes harder to heal. Instead of these two routes, let's together, supportively, consider the benefit of deeper acknowledgement of trauma so we may head towards healing. I encourage us instead to begin surviving well by recognizing the moral injury being caused to all of us and shaping new ways of protecting ourselves from further injury, while seeing that we can overcome all the better by strengthening our togetherness. In these last 2 minutes, I encourage us to build stronger bonds of supportive web-like connectedness and make new and beautiful quilts that tell of our sufferings, our healings, our longings for future freedom and liberation. We can start surviving and healing from moral injury together as we consider what happens when the injury occurs. There is a moral, spiritual, and psychological distress which spills over into a variety of elements of life, restricts a person's sense of being and feeling spiritually alive, and our active service may lack levity and liberty and joy and freedom. I guess a very simple introductory plan to surviving would be, first, notice the injury. Second, decide in what ways it might be possible to say no thank you to any further injury within the existing active service being undertaken. With allies and peers, psychological and spiritual support, make plans for this saying no as a quilted, web-like approach to spiritual journeying. And with similar or different allies and peers, seek healing from the injuries that have already occurred. This may take some time. Let's seek wisdom and slow thinking so future choices are not made in a fight or flight response mode, but in a more healed knowing, which suits a future of met needs and positive feelings. Surviving the systemic injustices present in the C of E requires good self-care, effective self-awareness, and honest and transparent peer support networks. And we need spiritual accompaniers and directors who will validate our lived experiences without overriding or dismissing us. I'd encourage us to make use of all well-being opportunities we can find alone and together, including therapy, retreats, and quiet quitting. This will all help with the surviving. And when I say quiet quitting, I imagine that for some, quitting from any voluntary actions in the realms of being compliant, submissive, or graciously restrained, quitting from that could be quite liberating. Although the Church may prefer to discuss its conduct through its inner interpretive framework of theological and ecclesiological discourse, for me, using the human rights perspective helps identify who is injured and who has the most unmet needs in the C of E. For those of us with many unmet needs, or who find ourselves injured, I propose that we see surviving well as a stronger strategy than compartmentalizing injustice so we can just do our jobs, or by becoming burnt-out martyrs for the cause. Instead, to finish, let's encourage ourselves to say no more to further injury and together begin to recover well and find collective healing.
Thank you, Jeremy. Listening to you talk, I've got a question here, which I'll come to in a second, but just listening to you talk, it reminded me of something that Bishop Rose was saying about how she refuses to go to the Chrism masses and show gracious restraint in those special ones for traditionalists, Anglo-Catholics, those who don't recognize her as a priest. And struck me that in contrast, in my own diocese in London, our bishop very graciously does attend those events. And, I see photos of her just with all these men who don't accept that she's a priest, let alone a bishop. And it annoys me. It's gracious restraint too far, yeah? And I think that's what you're saying, Jeremy, isn't it? There's a choice, yeah? As a bishop, female bishop, do you do that and effectively inflict moral injury on yourself, as Rose says, by opening yourself up to that humiliation or not? Anyway.
Martin, sorry, can I? Yeah. I think there was somebody who didn't get to ask a question this morning who might have written a question now.
Oh, yes. I think this might be this one, yeah?
Yeah.
Shall I read it?
Can we make sure that we can hear from that person?
Yes, let's do that now. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the right question. From a human rights perspective...
Is this yours? Yeah, great.
What is your position on further gender-based intersections by working towards equality for cisgender women only. Do you feel that we are continuing to inflict moral injury on transgender and non-binary people within the church?
Yes, I mean, I think that's more of a statement than a question, and I agree and can concur. And that where there are, obviously human rights legislation, protected characteristics is lagging behind, where it only talks about sex and we're not talking about multiple gender rights. But I would see that as a very profound protected characteristic, even if not defined in law yet, but that also creates a huge variety of intersectional discriminations, compounded discriminations. It's a crucial element, and it will be important for women in the church as an organisation to think about how historically you've been talking of women and men for good reason, but now it's 2024 and we need to find different ways of talking. Like in my talk, I talked about folks nearly all the way through. There are different ways, but we've got to learn that. And sometimes some of us might need to do that from the beginning as we start this new type of conversation. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, part of the issue is that this discrimination, as it's provided in the church, is in this kind of binary way, isn't it? It's like, you know, these are rules that apply to women, obviously undefined by the Church of England, but there we are. That is what we're in saying. We're trying to bring these arrangements to an end. That's what we're looking at. Thank you, and thank you. Do you have any advice for an ordinand in training for how I and others like me can maintain our own well-being in the face of all the moral injury that might be ahead of us?
It's partly getting the spiritual accompaniment peer-to-peer. Was that online, or is the person here?
That was online.
Solidarity, and hi to all the online folks. Really important to get the peer-to-peer accompaniment and any other guide accompanier right. I know that some people have figured out how not to make vows about mutual flourishing, and we'll hopefully talk more about that on the 15th of May, and that will be much more workshopy, and I know that Sue Hammersley and Ali Dory are going to be in that dialogue because there's lots of steps. But it's about collective action, working on it together and not feeling like it's a solo mission where we have to become patriarchal knights in shining armor, fighting evil knights on some kind of horrible thing. We quilt it together. But I think it's a big challenge, particularly for ordinands. Hearing some of the things I've said today, and I'm conscious of that. And that's where I just encourage back into this healing mode of self-protection.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dean of Women's, just because it won't be heard on the broadcast, the Dean of Women's Ministry and connecting with them might be part of building that support network, I think was what was said.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're going to have to leave it there for questions. As you know, 15th of May, if you want to follow up a bit more with what Jeremy's been talking about here. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
That's in the evening, 7 p.m., isn't it?
7 p.m.